Thank you to the Penn Program on Regulation for hosting our webinar today, and thanks especially to Megan Downey and her colleagues at the Regulatory Review for the incredible work they did in editing the 40 essays in this series as a whole. I'm sure it's apparent to everyone who's on this call, this meeting today, the worldwide nature of the COVID-19 crisis, the scale of the crisis, which has gone far beyond what any of us could have anticipated when it first hit in China in late December, January. One thing that is incredibly remarkable for those of us like myself and Professor deLisle who study China is that in late February, there were like 77,000 cases in China, mostly concentrated in Wuhan, a city in Hubei province. And now we've reached a point where there are 16.8 million cases throughout the world, about 5 million cases in the U.S. alone, 156,000 deaths in the U.S. So the scope and the scale of this crisis is truly remarkable. The series that the Regulatory Review has edited and published over the past few months contains, again, 40 essays, 25 country case studies that we hope will not only be of intellectual interest, but also potentially a source of useful ideas for how we can all, in each of our different countries, including here in the United States, proceed in better addressing the pandemic and its subsequent effects. There are many essays in the series that are wonderful, and we are very happy that we have 4 of the authors here with us today to get into the details of their particular case studies and represent the series as a whole. And so let's go into an initial round of questions to them. And we will very quickly then move to hearing questions from you in the audience, which you can send to me either through the chat function or through the Q&A function. So as I indicated, we all know that the virus first began in China. In Wuhan was the first place where we really saw the incidence be very high. And so I think it makes sense to start with Professor Jacques deLisle of Penn Law School and the director of the Center for the Study of Comparative China, whose essay is titled, The Chinese Administered State is Both a Blessing and a Curse. So I guess the question for Jacques is, why do you say it's both a blessing and a curse? And what are the main takeaway points that you think our audience should take about the way that China has addressed this virus?
I'll have to credit or blame the editor for the title, but I think it's pretty accurate, which is that both the successes and the failures in China's response, I think, reflect some pretty deep-seated and, to China watchers, familiar characteristics of the Chinese administrative state. So if you look at the initial failure, and there was a delay, not as bad as in SARS, and partly because of reforms that have been taken in response to SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome from 2003. But there still was a delay in getting information from the local level up to the central authorities and the public health authorities, the Center for Disease Control in China, and out to the public. So what caused the delay? Well, basically, it's built into the Chinese system that if you are a public health official at the local level, you are pulled in 2 different directions. You're accountable to the omnicompetent party and government at your own level, the city level or the provincial level, and you also answer up in a bureaucratic chain of, say, public health authorities up to the center in Beijing. And those authorities can have different incentives. And so authorities at the local level, who often tend to dominate in this tug of war, have an incentive often to try to keep bad news quiet. Because if there's a problem, they're blamed for it. And so they want to hold it quietly, deal with it at the local level. If it does get out, then they're in double trouble for having covered it, but it's a real tough bet. And so local public health authorities wound up trying to keep this somewhat quiet. It's compounded by what I call the Spider-Man problem, not terribly original, but basically because you're responsible for everything, because you're so powerful, you're responsible for everything. So you're on the hook if it goes badly. This was compounded with COVID because of 2 unfortunate bits of timing. One is that the local People's Congress meeting, which is a preliminary thing at the local and provincial level before it goes up to the national level in Beijing, those are going to be held about the time COVID came out. And it was on the eve of Chinese New Year, when everybody was going to be traveling. So you really didn't want bad news in a political season, but on the other hand, if you didn't deal with it, it was going to be potentially spreading all over China. So that's one problem. The other piece of this being pulled in 2 directions is that you do report up the chain, but the public health system is a fairly weak bureaucracy in China. And so although the center dispatched people down to Wuhan to look into the initial reports, they were kind of stymied by these local officials. And because there are both of these poles, both horizontal and vertical, local officials sometimes either get caught in the middle or shirk. So we have some indications of the mayor saying, I couldn't have disclosed this information publicly because that's the responsibility of the health system. And so you wound up with all of this sort of bureaucratic ambiguity and ambivalence, creating a delay of a few weeks, which was a big deal. It's compounded by another feature of the authoritarian order, which is whistleblowers get silenced. The famous Dr. Li was warned not to send his WeChat remarks to his peers about the initial outbreak of these mysterious pneumonia cases. And the media is not allowed to report freely, so the information doesn't get out. That's the bad news story. More briefly, the good news story is that the response once the information got to the top level was pretty darn quick. And it showed the strengths of the Chinese system. The ability to mobilize a huge amount of resources, sending in people, medical personnel, people to lock down Wuhan in a quite serious way, and to track and trace, to get people's identity, to track them with the high-tech surveillance state and the low-tech structures from many years ago that watch people in their compounds and know who comes in and out of a housing unit and things like that. And you could do that with the kind of ability to mobilize resources that an authoritarian regime like China's has, and without the sort of civil liberties and privacy constraints that would lead to people being queasy about having to show a QR code on their phone to get onto the subway and things of that ilk. And people don't resist as much the wear a mask mandate and so on. So what happens is when you've got a crisis like this, a system which ordinarily suffers from serious implementation problems, slippage, resistance, shirking, when it has a target and geared up into campaign mode, it can really be quite effective. Now, it's crudely effective. This is a kind of hammer being brought down, much more authoritarian, much more restrictive of individual behavior, but it kind of worked. So you got much more effective response in the U.S., but a much less human rights, if you will, or civil liberties cognizant one than you saw in a place like, say, Taiwan or Hong Kong, even, which were fairly successful in dealing with their outbreaks.
So on the one hand, certain what you call pathologies of governance, which hindered the initial detection of the virus, but then some formidable capacities later came into play that have helped to mitigate the effect of the virus. Well, the next place that really became a hotspot for the virus was Europe. And we have Florentin Blanc with us from the OECD, who not only wrote an essay for the series, but earlier was involved in a working paper that the OECD issued on the regulatory challenges of the crisis. So I want to invite Florentin to speak a little bit about the European response, and perhaps you could especially focus on a country like Italy, which is particularly interesting in that it initially seemed to do quite badly with the virus, but then later actually seemed to have done a little bit better. So from your vantage point from the OECD, how does Italy in particular look and the European response generally?
Thanks, Neysun, and it's a privilege to be able to speak to this virtual gathering. And I had the, you could say, dubious privilege to be based in Italy because we have a big project there, working on a regulatory implementation, if you will. And so that's one of the reasons why I know more about Italy. First, because it was the first struck country outside of Asia, and it seemed that at first glance to many countries to be an anomaly, and then it became a kind of forerunner of what happened later. So maybe building on what was said just before on China, you could say, I mean, the crisis shows both the weaknesses and the strengths of any system, right? So Italy has strong technical skills and medical skills and a good medical base network, but often has problems in agglomerating and managing information. So it does seem in a little bit of an ex post analysis that early signs of something weird happening, something which nobody was quite sure what it was, were missed, right? So at a point when China was still playing down the virus, when WHO was still relying on what China was saying, so when it wasn't clear whether it had gone out, whether human transmission was really a problem, there were strange cases in Lombardy, and there were doctors trying to escalate the cases, and this was ignored because the upper level was kind of too busy, right? I mean, you have this kind of information management problem, which is quite a shame because Italy has a single payer system and has potentially a great view of everything that's happening in healthcare, and this kind of got missed. The second weakness was, you could say, politics in all the senses. So regional politics, Italy is a kind of semi-federal country, not quite as federal as the US, but quite federalized, and you have complicated coalition and rivalry politics. So locking down was a big problem. Everybody was trying to avoid lockdown and to say, well, no, we don't really want it, not here, not there. Also because for obvious, actually, reasons of links with China, the first struck region was, speaking to a US audience, very much the equivalent of New York State in terms of this being the prime economic region, but more like if you did New York State plus California plus Texas plus Illinois in one state. And that would be Lombardy for Italy. It's more than a sixth of the country. It's 1/4 of GDP in one region. And the decision they had to take was, do we lock down this place? Which basically, do we annihilate right now the entire GDP of the country? Or do we maybe wait one more week to see if something goes slightly better? It's a very hard decision to take, right? If things happen in a periphery or in something that's a little bit less critical, it's a bit easier. And of course, Italy has this very unfavorable population structure with a lot of old people, and so suffered particularly from this virus being partly extremely deadly for older people. On the side of a really, seen from outside, what was a shame was that, as usual, you have a lot of preconceptions between countries. And in Europe, you have a lot of people who always are like, oh, well, Italy is this kind of place where there's a mafia and they do pizza and whatever, and gelato. And there's this kind of ignorance that, well, Italy is still, anyway, one of the largest economies and most developed in Europe and has very strong scientific and medical capacity. So if things go really badly in Italy, it's probably not a good sign for you. And even if you feel you're better, you should probably worry really, really strongly. And everybody missed completely. I mean, most countries missed the coach completely, or the train, or the bus, whatever you want to call it. France didn't learn anything. I mean, essentially, France ended up replicating everything that Italy was doing 1 week later and having exactly the same curve, exactly the same death rates, slightly better because the population structure is less old. And the final thing, and we've got a new paper also going out at the OECD on this, is a specific regulatory angle where Italy was hampered, and that was clearly not the only country. There were issues in the US, issues in France, etc., by two big things. One was the capacity or the incapacity to talk candidly about risk and uncertainty, like to communicate these things like, we don't really know, maybe we should be careful, maybe we don't, we can't tell you for sure that you're all going to die, but probably there's something a bit weird here and we're not quite sure. And the other was legacy rules and administrative structures which were not built for a crisis and which make it much slower to respond. One obvious one in Italy, I mean, Italy didn't do the whole thing of the US in revalidating the testing methods. They straight adopted the German and WHO ones, which was a good move. But they took weeks, even months, before allowing private labs to do testing for COVID. They had old rules that only state labs and only specifically authorized state labs could do testing for epidemic diseases, which had made absolutely no sense and constrained testing capacity at the peak of the pandemic. So now they have fantastic testing capacities. They've been testing, I mean, as President Trump, they've really been testing more than anyone else, right? Or at some stage was the case. But it came far too late. I mean, the testing capacity, the ramping up was delayed. So there's a few good lessons to learn here.
So in some ways, it seems as if the Italian case is one in which you had these reluctance to act quickly, a lot of coordination challenges, but eventually a response that managed to solve some of those coordination problems and also to ramp up testing. And these are points that are also developed in great detail we have actually 3 essays on Italy in the regulatory review series by Nicoletta Rangon, Maria Di Benedetto, and Fernanda Nicola. And so participants in this meeting may want to look at those as well. Well, let's keep our tour going and maybe move now to the Middle East. Elena Chachko wrote about Israel. One of the early essays in the series you published in late April, and that was a time when it seemed as if Israel had done a fairly good job of crushing the virus, in part through the use of some emergency powers that were troubling to you and your co-author Adam Scheiner. It's being reported now that there's a huge spike in Israel. So maybe you can also reflect on how the story has evolved since you wrote, but maybe starting with the concerns that you raised in your essay with Adam.
Sure. So let me just reiterate my thanks to the program and to the student editors who have done an incredible job editing the posts and creating what was an amazing and enlightening series. So I agree, Neysun, that it's a good place to start in sort of reviewing the trajectory of the Israeli response. And you are right. At first, it was a success story because Israel was pretty aggressive early on in imposing curfews and closing the borders, in going further than many other Western countries had at that point in the crisis. And that was successful. That limited the number of cases, that sort of created the sensation that the outbreak was under control. But then everything basically went sideways. Because the government was very quick to declare victory, essentially, and to tell people to just go out and party, to open up the economy, and they did, resulting in a renewed outbreak that the government is now struggling to contain. And I should note, because that's an essential point in order to understand what has been going on, that the crisis hit on top of a prolonged political crisis in Israel where we had 3 rounds of elections that failed to produce a government. And then the crisis hit, a government was formulated ostensibly to deal with the crisis. The crisis was checked, contained. Then they opened up the economy, and now the government is torn by internal debate about what to do next and how to handle this crisis. That's clearly going to stay with us for an extended period of time. So that's the factual development of things on the ground. And I'd like to talk about 3 main points that we can derive from assessing the Israeli response and what has been done so far, things that I've, as you mentioned, covered in this analysis with Adam Scheiner. So the first main thing is the heavy reliance in Israel on emergency powers. So Israel has a very permissive emergency regime to begin with for security reasons from the day it was established. The coronavirus essentially led the government to create additional emergency authorities and to utilize existing ones in ways that it had not done before to deal with a civilian crisis. And what the other thing that's worth emphasizing is that what started as emergency measures is slowly becoming normalized. So if at first those emergency measures were measures taken by the government on its own authority, unilaterally, skirting oversight from both the courts and the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, as time went by and pursuant to judicial requirements in part, the government was forced to enshrine some of those measures in legislation, and I'll talk about the main one perhaps, which is electronic surveillance. And now we get this situation where what started as invocation of emergency powers to address the COVID pandemic has now been sort of enshrined in primary legislation to deal with a civilian crisis, not a national security crisis in the traditional sense. And this creates precedent for the future. This creates the atmosphere that those are legitimate measures that the government is allowed to invoke to deal with something that's not a war or a terrorist threat as it had done before, which moves the goalposts for future government action. So that's the first point. The second point is the heavy reliance on the national security establishment. I think this pandemic revealed the lack and gaps in capacity in the Israeli administrative state where it comes to dealing with a prolonged public health crisis. And so we're seeing that the government has relied heavily on the ISA, colloquially known as the Shabak, the Internal Security Agency, to conduct surveillance, to do contact tracing in lieu of civilian agencies that you would expect to be tasked with this kind of work when we're talking about a public health emergency. And this has been extremely controversial, but as I said, as time went by, you see it enshrined in regulation and becoming more and more routinized, this kind of mass surveillance. And you're seeing other functions performed by the military and by the ISA that, frankly, I don't see why the ISA or the military should be managing. And one example is information analysis and gathering about the status of COVID in Israel right now, which has been done in part by the military for no apparent reason. So reliance on the national security establishment is another thing that comes out of this crisis pretty clearly. And the final point I want to make has to do with the ability to plan ahead. So what this reveals is Israel is super good in dealing with a crisis that lasts 2-3 months, like it did in the beginning, declared victory. There was the sense that we've conquered the plague. But then when it comes to dealing with a public health emergency or a civilian crisis for an extended period of time, you see that the administrative state is essentially at a loss, and we're starting to play around and experiment with all kinds of organs that didn't exist before, like a corona cabinet, whose authorities are not clear and not defined, and it's essentially a mess. So those are the three main takeaways I think I'd want to highlight from the Israeli experience with COVID.
Great, and I think it's important to underscore the point you made earlier in your comments that there are a number of what we typically think of as liberal democracies, especially in the West, that have approached the pandemic using tools that cause some degree of consternation from a separation of powers standpoint, from the use of emergency powers standpoint. And so that's clearly a theme that you develop in your essay. I think readers may want to also look at Yoav Dotan's response to yours and Adam's essay, in which he suggests that the Israeli court system did have some meaningful check function that they were exercising. Obviously, that's something for the participants who are interested to go look at in more detail. But I think you're also introducing a new point now today with the passage of time of whether after the initial lockdown, whether it was opened up too quickly, which I'm sure is something that is of great interest to especially U.S. audiences. Well, we should now move on to Latin America. I'm seeing, as I'm about to go to Jorge Contesse, professor at Rutgers Law School, that we also have our first question in the Q&A from Bruno Cunha, who wrote for the series about Brazil. And Bruno's question dovetails nicely with what I plan to ask Jorge, so I'll combine those, and I'll also encourage the panelists the participants in this meeting to start asking questions in the Q&A and the chat, and we'll turn to those after Jorge's response. So Jorge, what I was going to ask you was to, not only talk about Chile, but to put it in the larger context of Latin America, which we know is a area of the world which is suffering particularly now with the virus. In his question, Bruno notes that among the 10 most affected countries in the world so far, 4 of them are in Latin America. And he particularly points out not only Chile, but also Brazil, Peru, and Mexico. And he notes that your country, Chile, and Brazil, which he wrote about, are countries that traditionally we've understood to have rather strong state capacity. So I wonder if you could reflect on not only your own case of Chile, but in line with Bruno's question, what's gone wrong in Latin America? What explains the ways in which all these diverse countries in the region are struggling with the virus?
It's hard for me to make a full-scale description of Latin America. People tend to think of Latin America as sort of a unique and homogeneous experiment or experience, and I would resist that picture. There are different ways in which countries have reacted, and we should take stock of those different ways in which governments address this pandemic. What I would What I would say, though, is that not just in Latin America, but I think worldwide, the crisis has exacerbated already existing structures of inequality, political inequality, social inequality, and certainly economic inequality. And that's true for Latin America, which is what's been happening in the past months as the virus hit. In the specific case of Chile, I think there's a similar narrative to what Elena was referring to with the case of Israel. That is, the health crisis hit at a moment of in the case of Chile, unprecedented political constitutional crisis. So I invite readers to, of course, review the different essays, but also to think of this case as one in which the regulatory and administrative structure of the state was trying to address this crisis on top of an existing and ongoing political constitutional crisis. So you have that crisis, which basically means a social eruption in October of last year that was happening when the virus hit in early March. That was put somehow on bracket, and then the administrative state sort of comes in a way that's, I think, particularly interesting. By this, I mean that there was a very quick response from the administrative state. A few days after the World Health Organization declared this to be health emergency of international concern, the government of Chile reacted by declaring itself a one-year health emergency. That's early February, a month before the virus hit the country. And then in March, when the virus was already there, the government enacted decreed a state of exception, which is still undergoing. So those are very specific and powerful tools from the perspective of, here you have an administrative state that is unleashing, if you will, significant power, and the health code, the health regulations in Chile give tremendous leeway to health authorities when the president has declared a health emergency. So you have an existing political and constitutional crisis on the one hand, and on top of that, you have a very powerful state that nonetheless seems either unwilling or unable to actually address and tackle this pandemic. So my take here is to look at how interesting the case of a state that has so many legal resources, requisition of property, curfew, established sanitary checkpoints, a number of measures that any administrative state would want to have. Well, Chile does have it from the health code, and it had it very early on. And yet, when I wrote my essay at the end of May, we had 87,000 cases. By now, that figure has gone up to 4 times. And we sometimes compete with the United States in the number of COVID deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. So it's been really interesting, and I would say dramatic, to see the incapacity of a powerful administrative state to provide and to give answers to the people who have been suffering, again, as I was saying at the outset, these exacerbated inequalities that we've seen, not just in Chile, but in Latin America in general.
And Jorge, can you just say an additional word about the issue of public trust in Chile that you highlight, especially in your essay for the series, that
Sure.
I think is connected to the endemic political problems in Chile that predated the virus, but certainly played a role in Chile's response to it?
Sure, and I think it's also related to what Florentin was talking about, OECD, and something that he said and he wrote in his essay, which I think it's a great formula to the management of uncertainty. So what happened in the specific case of Chile is that you had this ongoing political crisis with a very weak government that somehow tried to seize the opportunity of coming out stronger with this crisis. And so what happened was that the rhetoric and the narrative was very early on one of we are prevailing. The president himself saying in March, there's no other world power that is as prepared as Chile. We will be a model for the rest of the world. Sort of very competitive tone that was unnecessary. And so the government kept that narrative at the same time as the scientific community was saying, wait a minute, we don't have enough data to really know that we are taming the beast here. We're not sure. There's missing information for us to actually say that this is the right way to address this virus. And yet the government kept the message of we're doing fine, we've flattened the curve when we had not even reached the peak. And so people started saying, I'm not sure. I'm seeing the president of the Medical Association saying there should be an entire lockdown, and the government is implementing this, what they call dynamic quarantines, which is basically imagining Manhattan having a lockdown for the people in the Upper West Side, not for the people in Harlem. It's just impossible to have checkpoints in the city that is so dense. So this is talking about Santiago itself. So at some point you had that very specific problem of people distrusting the government. 7 out of 10 Chileans were said to distrust the government, what the information that the government was relaying. And so that created, I think, from the perspective of regulatory powers, a significant issue. Having those powers and yet not earning the public's trust, it eventually became a major political and legal problem to deal with.
We're starting to get the questions fast and furious in both the chat and the Q&A, and I encourage everyone to continue sending them in. One of the questions that I think also, we had just talked a little bit about Latin America as a region, and I do want to talk to Florentin for a moment about Europe as a region, because your study, the OECD study, was looking at Europe generally. One of the questions in the chat asked us about Greece, which the questioner suggested maybe Greece is a good case study. And so I wondered if it's similar to the way Jorge spoke a little bit about, and Bruno's question spoke about Latin America as a region, if you could say a few things about the European response generally, and perhaps moving beyond critiques of the particular countries, but talking about what kind of reform agenda your report suggested for the continent as a whole. Oh, and Florentin, you have to turn on your mic.
Sorry, I was specifically thinking about some of the questions as they came out, and I'm fortunate to also work a bit in Greece. So I'll start with Greece. I think for the Greek government, and I was quite close to some people there working on it, there was this big fear that after the financial and economic crisis which struck Greece, they really didn't have any spare capacity to deal with the COVID spike. And they had zero arrogance or feeling self-confident versus Italy. So they looked at what was happening in Italy and they were like, that's really bad. We have to take it extremely seriously right now. So I think what we see, and that's a little bit in reaction to what Jorge was saying about Chile and some other countries, you may not have needed some exceptional powers or some incredible things like, again, also what we heard about Israel, right? That you exceptional powers, security measures, was mostly often about taking it very seriously, taking it early, and being relatively consistent, is I think what worked in Greece. And it doesn't make them immune to further problems, but it did work. They were extremely consistent, very fast, and doing things from the onset. The second thing, I think what we saw in Europe was the difficulty of learning, was something like this kind of belief that it happens to others, this or that country is not serious. We don't believe it. If it happens to them, it's their fault. And then it slowly percolated that, it keeps happening to all kind of other, richer and more prestigious countries. So probably we should kind of start to wake up. What probably played a stronger role in success than institutions, constitutional powers or legal powers, etc., was political consensus. I think that's what you can say about Germany, which got one of the the best outcomes. I mean, it's not a fantastic outcome by any means, but it's far better than nearly everybody else in larger countries. And of course, they did have a lot of spare physical capacity in terms of testing and in terms of hospitals. But they also had a very coherent political response with pretty much no disagreement between federal and federated and between different political parties. Everybody was on board. It's like, yeah, we have a health crisis. We need to do something. We need to do stuff, right? And even Italy was not that bad. I mean, you did have some political games, but they stopped relatively quickly. And to some extent, the federal structure was sometimes useful in that some regions did better because they diverged. I mean, the central authorities were a bit slow sometimes to react, and some regions like Veneto were faster. So Veneto was one of the key, most affected regions at the beginning, and then very quickly went down the league. So what we did see, if we go recommendations, I mean, there's certainly the conclusion could be you don't need that many exceptional powers, you don't need that many things which massively restrict liberties or whatever, but you need coherence, you need risk analysis and risk response capacity. You need to be able to analyze signals and data and respond quickly, and you need to review rules which may hinder the response. Like a lot of the problems were linked to public procurement rules on PPE, etc., with rules on converting production, on ramping up production of stuff which was imported was certainly not available. You had the physical capacity to do it, but then you still need some permits, some approvals, some this and that. Depending on the countries, was faster or slower. And the same is, letting in new products, etc. So there's a number of rules and structures that need in the aftermath of this crisis to be reviewed and seen whether they're fit for purpose. But I think definitely Germany and even eventually Italy and others show that you don't need to go all authoritarian to manage it. That's clearly not the case. You need to be coherent and decently organized and not completely ignore signals, obviously.
And Florentin, one of the points that you really emphasize in your essay that also is connected to the OECD report has to do with coordination, the problem of coordination between different levels of authority. And I see a question now from Rob Glicksman, who's also one of our authors, and I believe will be on the next panel that's focused on the U.S. So Rob asks whether anyone, and I think I want to particularly pose it to you, could be more specific about this question of coordination among different levels. What precisely was the thing that worked or didn't work that you were trying to highlight in your OECD report and in your essay for the series?
Okay, so I think one thing which nobody got really right until very late was coordination between countries. In particular, when it goes to beggar my neighbor kind of stealing procurement of others. There was a lot of these even within Europe and definitely between the EU and the US. One thing which some countries got decently right was coordination between federal and federated levels, at least for federal or quasi-federal states. But there's also a lot of coordination between different parts of the health system, public and private, more administrative and more care delivery, different medical health care and public health prevention structures, like you would say in the US, the CDC and the Institute of Infectious and Allergic Diseases, etc. And all of these things, again, with time constraints in mind, right? I mean, I think that's the kind of things you need to review in the aftermath of the crisis to make them work better. And we have some signals suggesting that there's something that, for instance, South Korea did really well after the MERS crisis and got removing barriers to testing, making sure that all providers can be used, making sure that all state organizations work well together, making sure that data gets processed quickly. All this was really crucial to how South Korea responded. I saw someone had a question on Taiwan. I mean, one thing Taiwan responded so quickly that they essentially exterminated the problem before it started. What struck me, because that's something we're working on right now, is they were able to do so largely due to old-style intelligence. Right? They have their Chinese native speakers, okay, whichever type of Chinese language you want, some Mandarin or Cantonese. And so they were monitoring chat rooms, and they knew that something was amiss, even when China was essentially still saying there's no human-to-human contagion. Now, you probably can replicate some of that. So that's an interesting first point, is a lot of larger countries with decent capacity could pay a few people to monitor chat rooms in potential sources of emerging diseases. That would seem to me a very reasonable healthcare expenditure or public health expenditure. Another thing is there's a lot of lessons about analyzing data and using it when it starts emerging. In a way, Germany was lucky that something started to get really bad in Italy, and it was in northern Italy, which they know which as a country has a lot of connection with Germany, and so the Germans started to prepare at that point. If it had struck Germany first, no idea what would have happened, right? Whether Germany would have gone as well through the crisis. So catching early signals and managing these early signals seems to be a really interesting area to improve.
So Florentin, you're taking us to start thinking about some potentially generalizable lessons learned, and I would like for us to eventually conclude on that question. But since you mentioned Taiwan, I did want to invite Jacques deLisle to speak a little bit about how the Chinese case looks in comparative context with these neighboring countries, including Taiwan and also South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, which have also done reasonably well with the virus and not always using the same tactics that China has.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I mentioned Taiwan very briefly in my initial remarks. I mean, by and large, the Asian countries immediately along mainland China's periphery have done pretty well. And there are a bunch of, why. And Taiwan is in many ways the most outstanding case, right? I mean, there's single-digit deaths, cases in the very low triple digits, despite being at the near point of the vector for anything coming out from China, given the quantity of cross-strait travel. So, Taiwan snuffed it out very quickly without resorting to the kind of draconian measures of building walls across streets, not letting people go out except to get food, sort of people monitoring the doorways, the kind of thing you saw in China. And so what is one to make of that? Well, so the advantages of Taiwan and several other countries in the region, Japan was a little less successful. And I want to caveat all of this by saying that success can be fleeting. Singapore looked great, then it looked terrible, then it looked pretty good again. Hong Kong looked good, now it's starting to look shakier. And there are case-specific reasons for all of that. Singapore kind of neglected the guest worker contingent. Oops, that was a bit of a problem. In Hong Kong, we just seen some eruptions. But by and large, what can you tease out of these? Florentin's right that Taiwan watches China like a hawk for a variety of reasons that have to do with all sorts of threats, hardly limited to public health. Cultural and linguistic proximity certainly helps. But there are other things too. A lot of the countries that did very well had been through SARS and had been through MERS. And it had the virtue of focusing the mind. And just as China took a number of steps, not entirely successful, but one doesn't want to discount the success. I mean, the delay was fatal and costly in China, but it was a few weeks, not a few months, in most a few weeks, largely because of structures that were put in place for rapid response, rapid reporting. And China's got reasons I discussed for that not working so well, and Taiwan to work better. They set up essentially a rapid response public health structure specifically in response to SARS. Their Anthony Fauci is basically their vice president. They happen to have an epidemiologist who is very high up in the government, Chen Jianren, going vice president. And the response was driven by science. They gathered the data, they acted on the data. And, there's this, as this debate about do democracies or autocracies do better in dealing with this. The data points are all over the map, but democracies that aren't populist democracies, and populism has an uneasy relationship with science. Turn it over to the experts. Probably helps. Polarization was mentioned earlier. I think polarization doesn't quite fully map on the Asian cases, but it does in the sense of a civil society that is not at odds with government directives. And so people were pretty compliant because they basically trusted the government to respond. And in places like Taiwan, it's obviously an existential problem. You need a government, and people tend to reply. And in Hong Kong, indeed, the government was kind of forced by civil society. The sense was the government reacted slowly, but people who remembered SARS were out there and pushing for it. Transparency helps too. The ability to hold governments to account when they are not releasing the information or where they're not being terribly forthcoming does it as well. So I think all those things play into it. And to be fair, scale probably helps a little bit too. There have not been great success stories in really large countries. Now, there are other reasons, true, it's overdetermined, but Brazil looks bad, the US looks bad, Russia doesn't look so good, India doesn't look so great. The largest country that I think you can put clearly on the success side of the scale is probably Germany. You can scale it up, but I think it creates additional challenges just because at some level you are trying to induce particular behaviors at the very local level, and sort of the more layers you have to go through, the more diverse the population in a variety of ways. I think that gets tougher. Obviously, the U.S. has fallen down, as you'll talk about in your next webinar, worse than many others. But I would put a lot of weight on functional civil society, science-oriented governments, and the benefit, both socially and institutionally, of having been through something like this before, and therefore putting in place the mechanisms and having a population that's willing to listen to them.
Well, one thing, Jacques, that I think we all can appreciate about your answer is that there are some contingencies built in there, and it really reinforces for all of us that this is still a dynamic picture, what may be a success story. And we've already had some examples in this conversation. Israel may have been a success story at first and less of a success story later. Italy maybe was less successful at first and then later becomes better. And so these are all dynamic, fluctuating pictures. But a very important question that was posed by Chuck Sable from Columbia Law School, who I should say, by the way, is my first-year Foundations of the Regulatory State professor, asks all of you whether there are, at this moment in time, any potentially generalizable regulatory innovations that have emerged out of each of the contexts that you've looked at. And this would be, I think, the best way to end our conversation. So why don't we start with Elena, if you might want to speak to that question, and then we're going to run through the panel and then conclude.
Sure. So I have to say to begin with, I don't know how generalizable anything is when we're talking about a pandemic that's a once-in-a-generation thing. So even if we come up with ideas for how to better handle public health crisis in the future, I don't think, or at least I hope, it's unlikely we'll see anything comparable in the foreseeable future. If we look at the Israeli case in terms of what is generalizable, what is good, I think in terms of handling a public health crisis, the fact that it's a very centralized government, which makes it easy to control localities, to issue directives that get implemented relatively fast. There's a centralized decision-making mechanism. Those are, in theory, good things for dealing with a public health crisis like the one we're dealing with now. I wouldn't rush to recommend it because it has lots of other downsides in other areas, and as we have seen in the Israeli case, it also entails risks of abuse and overreach and individual right violations. So I think it's hard to recommend anything as the silver bullet based on the Israeli experience. I think some of the fundamental characteristics of the system are helpful in dealing with a crisis like this, but I think there are downsides to centralization that need to be taken into account as well.
Jorge, how about from Chile or Latin America more generally?
I would say two things that are related to Jacques' question and also Rob's question. What worked well was the coordination between private health providers and the public sector. That was remarkable, and that also is in response to the tremendous powers that the administrative state has to force private providers to work together and along the public health authorities. That was very interesting, and I would urge researchers to look at that model, how it worked. It's somehow weakened the enhanced inequalities that we always see in the context of health as a social right, if you will. And a significant problem related to what Elena was saying was the centralization of the decision-making processes. We saw significant problems with mayors and like local authorities saying we need more power instead of relying on the central administration to go through to, for example, provide food, provide aid. It seemed that was a sort of too much bureaucracy to be able to help the people on the ground. And one lesson that I think it's an unsuccessful story is the concentration of power in the administrative state that was not willing or able to delegate so that the local authorities could manage the local crisis.
And Florentin and Jacques, we have 4 minutes left, so you can divide those between the two of you. Florentin, why don't you go first?
Okay, I'll be really fast. I would just say first, I'm unfortunately worried that it may not be once in a generation, and we may be seeing more of that. One first thing is we are not doing enough on the remote causes. There's a lot to be said about how these particular crises links back to food safety issues in China, which have been challenges for this Chinese administrative state for a good 20 years. And this is partly the result of that. The second, one lesson I think we can draw is confidence is the ability to learn quickly. So to analyze data, respond to data, learn from other countries. And this has been mostly a big failure, but a few countries have done better. And that's something that you can potentially replicate. The third is remove barriers to response. We've talked mostly about how you design a response, but we did see at the OECD a lot of responses in terms of procurement, test rollout, whatever, hindered by administrative rules, which are supposed to prevent other potential or real risks. And that's something which needs to be reviewed more seriously. There are also barriers to the involvement of the private sector. This was a very good point which just came out. And in some countries, many countries, there are barriers to it. So that needs to be taken a look at. And I think, yes, I really like the point about, decentralization or centralization. There's a difficult balance to strike here, but it's a really important point. As I was saying, in Italy, some regions were able to do better because they didn't follow the quite restrictive guidelines on testing, which were initially there, for instance. They decided to just throw money at the problem and test everything they could find. And it worked better, and there were good reasons to think it would work. So that's definitely also one. And I would
apologize, Florentin, just because of time, we'll have to move to Jacques.
Yeah. Sorry.
All right. Well, the good news is I gave most of my suggestions in the answer to the last question about what works, and those may or may not be generalizable. So let me just add a couple of things in closing. First, I'd align with what Florentin just said. Oops, did you lose me?
Nope.
Okay. Like what Florentin just said, which I think the root causes issue is real here. That is, we've had a number of pandemics emerge from various places, a fair number of them from China. The question of regulating food safety, of regulating human-animal interaction with these wild animal markets, China has been still very slow to regulate that. And I think some international cooperation and pressure on that front may help. And I'd say two other lessons going forward that maybe not learning from what we did well, but what we've done badly. I worry a great deal about the turn away from international and scientific cooperation and data sharing. Vaccine nationalism, hacking that shut down the Houston consulate, at least the pretext for it. I think that's disconcerting. And I think that for those of us, and you know this well, Neysun, who are kind of China watchers, what happened in China wasn't a surprise. The things that worked and the things that didn't work were very consistent with what we knew about Chinese politics. I think a lot of people were gobsmacked, particularly with the U.S., about how badly it went and why. So I would urge, in thinking of these things going forward, thinking about the politics of implementing responses is something I put high on the policy reformers' agendas.
That's wonderful. It's exactly 5 o'clock. Our conversation is bursting at the seams, but we said we would conclude at 5, and so we will honor that. Thank you so much to all the panelists and to everyone who's been in this meeting for the wonderful questions that have come in. Obviously, as we've said a number of times, this is an ongoing story, a dynamic story. It'll be worth continuing to keep our eye on it. There will be another panel focusing on the U.S. On Wednesday, August 26th, the same time, same place. featuring Carey himself and also Rob Glicksman and Alison Hoffman from Penn Law School and other writers for the series. So please stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, thank you all, and goodbye.